So this is part 2 of the philosophy of freedom, the debate between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, especially concerning the framing of the Constitution after the failure of the Articles of Confederation. The Articles were America's first experiment in self-governance, and they failed spectacularly. They were drafted in 1777 and ratified in 1781. They reflected the Revolution's suspicion of power. Congress could request but not require. They could advise but not enforce. There was no executive, no judiciary, and no means to raise taxes or regulate trade. It was liberty by subtraction, essentially a government designed to do almost nothing. And at first, this seemed virtuous to the colonies. They had just escaped a crown and weren't eager to crown another one. But what looked like freedom on paper collapsed into paralysis. The United States printed competing currencies. They levied tariffs against one another and refused to fund Congress. Veterans went unpaid, debts mounted, and the economy faltered. And then came Shays' Rebellion. Farmers in Massachusetts, armed and desperate, shutting down courts that threatened to seize their land. Congress was too weak to intervene. You could only watch the republic it had created teeter toward chaos. And even Washington, who was longing for retirement, called the government a shadow without substance. Madison studied it like a doctor examining a dying patient. Hamilton denounced it as imbecilic, and the Articles had proved what Locke and Montesquieu had already warned us about, that liberty without structure is not liberty at all. And so for those who would still argue that power should rest solely within the states, the Articles stand as history's counterexample. That America tried that once, and it didn't work. The Rebellion of 1786 showed that freedom requires machinery, strong enough to act but bound by law. The delegates in Philadelphia met the next summer not because they wanted power, but because they saw liberty drowning without it. James Madison looked at the wreckage of the Articles and saw the deeper problem, the factions people divide. They divide by wealth, interest, ideology, and passion, and those divisions, when left unchecked, destroy republics from the inside. In Federal 10, Madison wrote that the latent causes of faction are sown into the nature of man. Freedom breeds disagreement, and disagreement breeds conflict. The challenge isn't to erase the factions, but to contain them. And where Anti-Federalists like Brutus and Sentinel imagined small republics unified by common interest, Madison saw danger there. Small republics fall easiest to major passions. His cure was a large republic where factions multiply until none can dominate. Representation would filter passion through reason, and ambition would counteract ambition. That idea remains the engine of American politics. We have a system that's built to argue with itself. Madison also understood that the health of the republic depends on civic integration, that public goods like schools and libraries and parks are not luxuries. They are the arenas where citizens in every faction meet. And privatization, by contrast, isolates and hardens divisions. A gated society breeds gated minds. So to Madison, education and civic space were the living extension of his theory. And by enlarging the sphere, you weaken the faction. The republic survives not through unity, but through structured disagreement held together by shared experience. In 1787, the memory of monarchy was still burning, and the framers feared any office that looked anything like a throne, but they also feared the paralysis. The Articles had shown that liberty without direction collapses into noise. Hamilton was willing to risk being called a monarchist to prevent that. In fact, in Federal 70, he argued for a single energetic executive, not for the sake of power, but for accountability. One president could act decisively and could be blamed when wrong. Divided executives hide behind confusion. Madison built walls and Hamilton built an engine. Where Madison feared factions tearing the country apart, Hamilton feared indecision, leaving it too weak to survive. You see, both sought justice, one through restraint and the other through responsibility. Through Montesquieu's eyes, though, concentrated power meant tyranny. Hamilton countered that power too diffused meant impotence. Energy, he said, could serve liberty if kept answerable to the people. That tension has defined every presidency since. Lincoln stretched executive power to preserve the Union. FDR wielded it to fight the Depression and war. Modern presidents claim emergency powers to bypass Congress. And each time, Hamilton's ghost asks the same question: when does energy for the people become authority over them? Alexander Hamilton never argued for domination. He argued for duty, for an executive that was strong enough to serve but bound by law and conscience. The danger he designed is the danger we still live with today: a presidency that must act boldly without forgetting who it serves. And so ratification was not a celebration. It was a knife fight over the soul of the republic. And when the Constitution emerged from Philadelphia in 1787, it wasn't greeted with universal applause. It was met with suspicion, with outrage, and with fear. You see, to many, it looked less like a blueprint of a republic and more like a rebirth of monarchy, just with new clothes. The men who raised that alarm called themselves nothing grand, really. They just simply called themselves the Federalists' opponents. History remembers them as the Anti-Federalists, though. Writers who, under Roman pen names like Brutus and Cato and Sentinel, warned that the new government's promises of order would end, as they always had, in empire. They were not anarchists. They were revolutionaries guarding against their own victory. Brutus, who was most likely Robert Yates of New York, was a philosopher of the opposition. He was measured and analytical and deeply alarmed by the Constitution's structure. He believed a consolidated republic over so vast a territory could never remain free. He wrote that history furnishes no example of a free republic anything like the extent of the United States. His argument was not abstract. Distance, he said, would breed indifference, and indifference always breeds tyranny. Representatives in a faraway capital cannot know the needs of the people. They will inevitably serve their own interests. The supremacy clause and the necessary and proper clauses, he warned, would swallow every restraint, turning the states into mere administrative provinces of a national government. Brutus was especially troubled by the power of the federal judiciary. He worried about judges being appointed for life, unanswerable to the people. He foresaw an unelected legal aristocracy that would interpret the Constitution, quote unquote, according to the spirit of it, and in doing so, expand federal power beyond recognition. And every modern argument about judicial activism or the deep state echoes Brutus. His vision of liberty demanded nearness, government close enough to see its citizens' faces. And then we have Cato, who was most likely the governor of New York, George Clinton. Where Brutus feared consolidation, Cato feared a crown. He believed the presidency itself was a seat of monarchy. The executive's energy, celebrated by Hamilton, looked to Cato like ambition in waiting. He wrote and asked, "Where is the security that this man will not become a king?" Cato saw the 4-year term and the possibility of re-election as an invitation to entrenchment. If you combine that with command of the military and control over appointments, and he saw the makings of a throne. He distrusted Hamilton's promise that unity meant accountability. You see, to Cato, concentrating power in one executive made the republic dependent on the virtue of a single man, a gamble history had never rewarded for very long. And his fears weren't baseless. The American presidency would, over time, accumulate power through precedent. Jefferson's Louisiana Purchase, Lincoln's wartime powers, Roosevelt's New Deal, Truman's emergency seizures, modern executive orders, each step is justified and each step expanding the office. Cato's warnings live on in every debate over executive overreach. From war powers to surveillance, he understood that tyranny rarely returns by declaration, it returns by habit. And then you have Sentinel. Most likely Samuel Bryan of Pennsylvania, Sentinel was the populist among them. He was fiery and indignant and allergic to aristocracy. His essays that were published in Philadelphia newspapers attacked not just the document, but the entire process itself. The Constitutional Convention, he wrote, had been conducted in secrecy by men of property and privilege, and the resulting plan with its long terms, indirect elections, and powerful Senate was designed to insulate the elite from the people. He called it a betrayal of 1776, a replacement of royal power with the rule of the rich. And Sentinel warned that it was The design of this new system to establish a government in which the great will have the advantages of the few over the many. You see, to him, the proposed federal system looked less like a republic than an oligarchy in waiting. He saw the language of checks and balances as camouflage for consolidation and class dominance. His demand was simple and radical: transparency, short terms, frequent elections, and direct accountability to the people, because without those, he said, the republic would rot from the top down. And now, in the age of lobbyists, dark money, and lifelong incumbents, Sentinel's prophecy feels less like history and more like a diagnosis. And not all the Anti-Federalists wrote essays. Some fought their battles face to face in state conventions, like Patrick Henry in Virginia, who thundered against ratification with the force of a prophet. He mocked the phrase "we the people," asking who authorized them to speak the language of we the people instead of we the states. He believed the Constitution had been smuggled past its mandate and would lead inevitably to centralized rule. George Mason, who had helped craft the Constitution, actually refused to sign it. His objections were simple: that it lacked a Declaration of Rights. Without explicit protections, he said, even the best structured government would become a machine for oppression. Their persistence gave the nation its conscience. Mason's refusal forced Madison's conversion, leading directly into the drafting of the Bill of Rights 2 years later. The Anti-Federalists were not united by solutions. They were united by suspicion, a belief that human nature, left unchecked, will turn power inward. And they did predict that a consolidated government would eclipse the states, that an executive would grow imperial, a judiciary would legislate from the bench, and a legislature would serve wealth over the public. They were not wrong about any of these. Every one of those prophecies has come true in some form. Their victory was partial but profound. The Bill of Rights, freedom of speech, the press, religion, assembly, and petition were all demanded by Anti-Federalists. The right to bear arms, the protection of homes and privacy, the guarantees of fair trial and due process were all insisted upon by their dissent. The Constitution we revere is half Federalist architecture and half Anti-Federalist alarm. The document's genius is that it contains both power and restraint, structure and suspicion. The Anti-Federalists lost the ratification battle, but they won the soul of the Republic. They ensured that liberty would always have a voice inside the law, that power would always be forced to explain itself. Their pamphlets still echo in every American argument over executive orders, federal spending, judicial reach, and the balance between security and freedom. They remind us that dissent is not disloyalty. It is the immune system of democracy. Because Brutus was right to fear distance, Cato was right to fear ambition, Sentinel was right to fear elites, and Mason right to demand the rights. The truth is that the Constitution's success always depends on its critics. The Anti-Federalist resistance made the Republic cautious, reflective, and self-questioning, qualities that remain its best defense against tyranny. Their fight was not against America, but for it, and their warnings still whisper through every debate where power forgets its purpose. All right, welcome to part two of the philosophy of freedom. We're on the Constitution and talking about the debates between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists, and now we're going to get into the Bill of Rights. Amendment 1. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion, or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble, and to petition the government for redress of grievances. The First Amendment is the heartbeat of the Bill of Rights. It is Voltaire's laughter written into law. It's Diderot's hunger for knowledge turned into protection, and Jefferson's conviction that liberty depends on dissent. No other amendment so directly guards the people's voice against power. The colonies knew what it meant to live without free expression. British sedition laws made it a crime to criticize the crown. Truth itself was no defense. Printers were jailed, pamphlets seized, pulpits silenced. The Zinger trial of 1735, in which a colonial printer was acquitted for criticizing a royal governor, planted the seed that truth must be protected, not punished. And by the time of the Revolution, it was no longer theory. Speech and press were the weapons of the rebellion. Thomas Paine's common sense lit the fuse of independence with a pamphlet that would have earned him death in London. The Anti-Federalists insisted that these freedoms be spelled out explicitly. They had just fought a war to overthrow a government that jailed its critics. They would not thrust a new one without chains. The First Amendment was their insurance policy, the guarantee that truth could speak even when it embarrassed power. And the amendment is short, but it's vast. It protects 5 intertwined liberties. First, religion, both no establishment, that the government shall not create a state church, and the free exercise of. Citizens can worship or not worship as conscience dictates. Second is freedom of speech, the right to voice one's beliefs without fear of punishment from the government. 3 is freedom of the press, the right to publish and circulate information freely. 4, freedom of assembly, the right to gather in protest or solidarity. 5, freedom of petition, the right to demand redress from the government itself. And together these rights form a single ecosystem of liberty. Thought becomes speech, speech becomes assembly, assembly becomes movement, and movement becomes change. And the First Amendment was radical in 1791, and it remains radical today. Most governments in history have survived by controlling what people can say and believe. And the framers wagered that liberty would survive only if truth could speak without fear. And of course, Voltaire warned us that those who can make you believe absurdities can make you commit atrocities. And our First Amendment is the American answer to that warning. It's a firewall against absurdity and a shield for conscience. Its brilliance is that it protects speech we despise as fiercely as speech we adore. It protects art that offends, protests that disrupt, and journalism that embarrasses presidents. It assumes the public square is loud, unruly, and necessary. And to be honest, the First Amendment's promise was not universal at its birth. Women's political voices were dismissed as indecent, enslaved people could not speak for freedom, and indigenous nations were silenced under the flag that proclaimed liberty. And even as Madison wrote that Congress shall make no law, Congress passed laws restricting expression, almost notoriously, the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 that criminalized criticism of the government. And Jefferson called them a reign of witches, and they helped sweep him into the presidency. The contradiction has never fully disappeared. Each generation expands the amendment's promise only after watching it betrayed. And the amendment's history is really a story of dissent on trial. In Schneck versus the United States, the Supreme Court upheld the conviction of a man who distributed anti-draft leaflets during World War I. Justice Holmes coined the phrase clear and present danger, narrowing speech in wartime. And then decades later in Brandenburg versus Ohio, the court reversed course, holding that only direct incitement to imminent lawless action may be punished. In New York Times versus Sullivan, they established that public officials cannot sue for libel unless statements were made with actual malice. Free press, the court said, demands breathing space. In Tinker versus Des Moines, students wearing black armbands to protest the Vietnam War were protected. It said that students do not shed their constitutional rights to freedom of speech at the schoolhouse gate. In Engel versus Vitale, banning school prayer to employment division versus Smith, limiting religious exemptions in the First Amendment's religious clauses, continue to spar where our beliefs end and laws begin. Every generation redraws the boundaries of dissent, usually only after power overreaches. And it is still protected today. The press still investigates and publishes mostly freely. Citizens can still protest and assemble and petition without licenses from the state. Religion remains mostly plural, protected by distance from the government. It is restricted by corporate consolidation, where it's turned much of the press into a handful of profit engines. Protest has been confined to zones, and the surveillance state chills expression in ways more subtle but no less real than prisons. Speech is commodified and manipulated by algorithms that turn our discourse into division. The First Amendment was written to protect citizens from government censorship. It now faces the challenge of private monopolies over information itself. The First Amendment's dangerous, and that is really its genius. It protects the blasphemer and the dissident, and the protester and the whistleblower and the poet and the journalist and the crank. It shields words that wound as well as those that heal, because the alternative, silence enforced by power, is far worse. Madison and Jefferson did not promise a nation free from offensive words. They promised a nation strong enough to survive them. And the First Amendment bends power toward justice, not by eliminating the lies, but by giving truth a chance to fight back. It is both shield and battlefield. It remains the clearest reminder that liberty depends not on obedience, but on the noisy, unruly, and uncomfortable voices of the people themselves. The Second Amendment. Well, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Few sentences in American history have been so quoted, so misused, and so misunderstood. To many modern Americans, the Second Amendment stands as the guarantor of personal gun ownership, a sacred symbol of individual freedom. But to the people who wrote it, it meant something far more specific, and paradoxically, far less individual. It was not about private arsenals, it was about collective defense. The Second Amendment was written as an insurance policy against tyranny, a warning to any future government that the people themselves, organized in militias, would always remain the final guardians of liberty. And over 2 centuries later, that safeguard has been hollowed out. Its meaning was rewritten by politics and courts until the very purpose it was meant to serve has been completely erased. The Revolution had been a war against standing armies. The British had quartered soldiers in colonial towns and turned their guns inward. They had treated citizens as subjects. The memories of redcoats in the streets were still fresh in the delegates that gathered in Philadelphia in 1787. Men like George Mason and Patrick Henry feared the new Constitution would recreate the very evil they'd just overthrown, a permanent federal army. They said would be the death of freedom. Mason warned that no such thing as a standing army is known in any free government. And Patrick Henry thundered in response that the militia, sir, is our ultimate safety. The great object is that every man be armed. Madison tried to calm them in Federal 46. He painted a picture of balance. The federal government might command a standing army, but the states and the people would always command far more men, armed and organized as militias. To those would be opposed a militia amounting to near 500,000 citizens with arms in their hands, he wrote. The implication was pretty clear. The people themselves were the ultimate check against federal tyranny. The Second Amendment was the physical embodiment of that promise. The phrasing of the amendment is not decorative, it's very deliberate. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state is the reason. The right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed is the guarantee. The first clause gives the context, the second line the protection. The founders did not write that the right of the people to own weapons shall not be infringed. If they had meant to enshrine an unlimited individual right, they would have said so very plainly. But instead, they tied the right explicitly to militias, citizen armies raised for local and state defense, not private collections of arms. And even grammatically, separating the two clauses is nonsense. You wouldn't write that a strong heart being necessary to life, the right to pump blood shall not be infringed, and then claim that that's about jogging. The militia clause is not a preface, it's the whole spine. This matters because more than 2 centuries later in the District of Columbia versus Heller, the Supreme Court majority would declare that the first half of the amendment, the part about the militia, was merely prefatory, a kind of ornamental introduction. They claimed the right itself stood alone. Independent of its original civic purpose, that linguistic surgery changed everything. We'll come back to that decision in a few, but it's important to understand how the court dissected this sentence and how it explains the amendment's meaning was rewritten. And for now, it is enough to see what Madison wrote. The right to bear arms was a civic duty, not a personal indulgence. It was a shield against standing armies, not an excuse for chaos. And early America and the young republic understood it that way. The Militia Acts of 1792 required every able-bodied American to enroll for the local militia service and to provide his own arms. Weapons weren't trophies of personal liberty, they were tools of civic responsibility. And for nearly 150 years, the courts agreed with that. When the Second Amendment was mentioned at all, it was treated as a collective right tied to militias, not as an individual entitlement. The landmark case, United States versus Miller in 1939, upheld restrictions on sawed-off shotguns. It ruled that the Second Amendment protected only weapons with a reasonable relationship to the preservation or efficiency of a well-regulated militia. And that pattern held. Militias were the frame, not the footnote. But as the 19th century gave way to the 20th, the militia system withered. States abandoned regular musters, and the National Guard absorbed what was left of the old state militias, and crucially, was placed under dual control. The states in peacetime and the federal government in war. The balance Madison promised between federal armies and local militias collapsed. At the same time, the nation's relationship to firearms shifted from civic to cultural. The frontier myth glorified the armed individual as America's archetype. The pioneer, the cowboy, the rugged loner, firearms became symbols of self-reliance rather than collective defense. By the mid-20th century, the National Rifle Association, once just a benign marksmanship club, transformed itself into a political powerhouse. It began preaching that the Second Amendment protected individual ownership above anything else, a position that had never been law. Conservative think tanks and scholars took up the cause, reframing the debate as one of personal liberty against government intrusion. That decades-long campaign changed not only politics, but the courts themselves. In 2008, the Supreme Court delivered the decision that shattered 2 centuries of precedent. The case arose from Washington, D.C.'s handgun ban and requirement that all firearms in homes be kept disassembled or locked. Dick Heller, a security guard, sued, arguing that the law violated his Second Amendment rights. Justice Scalia's majority opinion declared that the amendment protects an individual's right to possess firearms for self-defense within the home, unrelated to militia service. Scalia argued that the military clause is merely prefatory. It announces one purpose but does not limit the right. Bear arms, he said, can mean to carry weapons for personal defense, not just military service. The founders, he claimed, understood the right to be self-defense as fundamental. He struck down the D.C. ban as unconstitutional. The dissent, written by John Paul Stevens, joined by Souter, Ginsburg, and Breyer, accused the majority of rewriting history. Stevens argued that the militia clause is controlling, not ornamental, and that for over 200 years courts have interpreted it that way. The majority, he said, had abandoned original meaning for ideology. Breyer added that even if an individual right existed, it must yield to the public interest and safety. The decision was seismic. For the first time in American history, the Supreme Court defined the Second Amendment as a personal right to gun ownership, untethered to militias, untethered from Madison's logic, and tethered instead to an entirely modern myth of individual armament. And here lies the central paradox. At the founding, the Second Amendment's purpose was very clear. It guaranteed the people the means to resist tyranny, including military oppression. In Federal 46, Madison explicitly envisioned the people and the states rising against a federal army should it ever be turned inward. But modern jurisprudence has erased that safeguard. Ex parte Milligan of 1866 ruled that civilians cannot be tried by military tribunals where civilian courts are open. That's reaffirming civilian supremacy, but limiting recourse to judicial review, not armed resistance. In Starling versus Constantine, Youngstown Street versus Tube v. Sabre, in Sterling versus Constantine, 1932, and Youngstown Sheet and Tube versus Sawyer, 1952, likewise struck down executive overreach, but again through courts. The Posse Comitatus Act of 1878 restricted the Army from domestic policing, but codified that only the federal government decides when its own deployments are lawful. And the result is, yes, the military may overreach, but no, the people may not lawfully resist it with arms. The founding principle of mutual check has been replaced by unilateral authority. On May 4, 1970, the Ohio National Guard opened fire on unarmed students protesting the Vietnam War at Kent State University. 4 were killed, 9 wounded, and they carried books, not rifles. Their deaths exposed the hollowness of Madison's assurance that citizens may not resist, courts will adjudicate later. The living may sue, the dead have no recourse. The Second Amendment was written to prevent precisely that scene. soldiers firing on citizens. But 2 centuries of legal evolution have rendered its safeguard symbolic at best. The absurdity deepens with the modern militia system. Because the National Guard was once the people's bulwark against centralized force, today it is under federal command whenever the president chooses. If a president federalizes the Texas Guard and sends it to Oregon or Chicago or Illinois, they cannot declare those troops unlawful or hostile. Its only recourse is to sue in federal court, asking the same government that deployed the troops to decide whether the deployment was legal. The government has become the sole judge of its own limits. This is exactly what George Mason and Patrick Henry warned against. A republic in which the states no longer serve as counterweights but as subordinates. And so what remains of the Second Amendment as a collective safeguard has been neutered. The citizen's right to resistance has been stripped by precedent. The states no longer command their militias as counterweights, and what survives is a narrow individual right to own firearms, sanctified by Heller and sustained by a powerful industry. The Second Amendment now functions less as structural check on tyranny than as cultural and commercial identity. The founders wrote it to keep the people free from oppression. Today, it mostly keeps the firearms market free to sell. And the Second Amendment was born from fear, the fear of standing armies and centralized power. It was meant to ensure that the people would never again face an occupying force in the streets. But the structure that made that promise possible, state militias, civic duty, and a government answerable to its own citizens, has long been eroded. And in its place stands a myth that equates ownership with freedom and commerce with liberty. Because over time, the government has not preserved the people's right to resist tyranny. It has preserved its own right to tyranny should it choose it. The irony of it is cruel. The amendment written to keep power accountable now mostly protects its consumer symbolism. What was once a collective duty of vigilance has become a personal fetish of possession. The second still speaks of freedom, but the echo no longer sounds like what Madison meant. Amendment 3. No soldier shall in time of peace be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner, nor in time of war, but in a manner to be prescribed by law. The Third Amendment rarely makes headlines. It has never inspired mass protest or partisan war. It is short, quiet, and rarely litigated. It's a constitutional wall so sturdy that few have tried to breach it. But behind its simplicity lies one of the most radical principles of the American Revolution, that the military serves the citizens, not the other way around. The Third Amendment is the purest expression of civilian supremacy. It is the line that separates democracy from militarism, liberty from occupation. Though it may seem an artifact of powdered wigs and muskets, its spirit is alive in every debate about privacy, surveillance, and the militarization of policing. Before America declared independence, quartering wasn't just an inconvenience, it was an insult. The Quartering Acts of 1765 and 1774 forced colonists to house and feed British soldiers. Homes became extensions of empires. Hearths turned into barracks. It wasn't just about lodging, it was about control. You see, a soldier under your roof meant the government lived with you. It watched you and reminded you daily of your subjugation. It blurred the line between private life and public rule. When Jefferson drafted the Declaration of Independence, he placed this grievance alongside taxation without representation. For quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, the colonists saw the practice as tyranny made literal, the state invading the home. The Third Amendment's brilliance is its clarity. It draws a bright, uncompromising line. The home is sacred. The government's soldiers, no matter how noble their mission, have no right to cross that threshold without the consent. This was more than comfort, it's philosophy. To the founders, the home was a nucleus of liberty, the one space where the individual was sovereign. Protecting it from military intrusion symbolized everything the Revolution stood for. The amendment does not ban quartering in wartime outright, but even then it requires congressional authorization, a reminder that military necessity must still answer to civilian authority. As with every part of the Bill of Rights, the Third's protections were not equally enjoyed, but still as principle it was revolutionary. A promise that the instruments of force would never again be lodged in the bedrooms of the governed. And the Third Amendment is rarely tested, but when it has been, its reach has surprised even scholars. In Ingblom versus Carey, striking New York prison guards were evicted from their state housing, which was then assigned to National Guardsmen brought in to replace them. The Second Circuit Court ruled that the guardsmen counted as soldiers, and that tenants, not just owners, were protected, and that the Third Amendment applied to the states through the 14th Amendment. It was a small case, but a profound reaffirmation. Because even in modern times, the military cannot take over civilian space without consent. The third has also appeared indirectly in cases concerning privacy. In Griswold versus Connecticut, the decision that recognized the constitutional right to marital privacy. Justice Douglas cited the third as part of the penumbra of rights, casting a shadow across the Constitution. The message was subtle but powerful. The third's protections of the home from soldiers implies a broader right of the individual to be left alone. Though no soldiers sleep in our guest rooms today, the principle of the Third Amendment faces quieter threats. Militarized policing blurs the line between soldier and officer. When armored vehicles roll through American streets, the imagery of quartered troops no longer feels very distant. Surveillance technologies and digital eyes and ears in our homes raise the same question in a new form. If the government can listen or watch without consent, how different is that from the redcoat at the hearth? National emergencies and disaster responses sometimes bring troops to domestic soil, but the amendment spirit reminds us that even well-intentioned soldiers are guests. Every time government power crosses a private threshold without consent, the Third Amendment stirs beneath the surface, whispering, "This is not who we are meant to be." The Third Amendment is the least cited clause in the Bill of Rights, but perhaps the most absolute. It contains no balancing test, no sliding scale. It simply says no. No soldier in the home, no intrusion by the armed hand of the state, no compromise on the sanctity of private life. It reminds us that liberty begins at the doorstep, that privacy is not an indulgence but a barrier between citizen and power, that the military strength must end where individual sovereignty begins. It was written in reaction to soldiers at supper tables, but its principle endures in a world of surveillance cameras and data collection, militarized policing. The forms have changed, the fear hasn't. And the Third Amendment is the Constitution's quiet promise that the Republic will never again live under occupation, not by armies of men nor by armies of machines. It is the simplest of all our freedoms, and for that reason, perhaps the most profound. The Fourth Amendment. The right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures shall not be violated, and no warrant shall issue but upon probable cause supported by oath or affirmation, and particularly describing the place to be searched and the persons or things to be seized. The Fourth Amendment is the hinge between liberty and authority, the line that defines where the citizen ends and the state begins. It tells power that your body, your home, and your private life are not open territory. That before it may touch, it must ask. Before it may intrude, it must justify. It is the amendment that transforms a government from a master into a servant bound by reason and law. It was written by people who knew what it meant to live under the knock of soldiers at the door. Under British rule, the colonists endured writs of assistance, general warrants that allowed customs officers to search any home, seize any goods, and question any person at will. They were instruments of humiliation as much as enforcement. And James Otis, a fiery Boston lawyer, stood before Massachusetts Superior Court in 1761 and called them the worst instrument of arbitrary power. John Adams later said that Otis's speech that day was a spark in which a child's independence was born. The Revolution was much about privacy as it was about taxation. Freedom from arbitrary search was not an afterthought, it was the seed of rebellion. And the Fourth Amendment doesn't ban searches outright, it makes them accountable. It replaces the king's decree with judicial oversight, demanding reasonableness, that the government must have cause grounded in fact, not suspicion. Particularity, warrants must specify where, whom, and what. No fishing expeditions. There must be probable cause. Accusation alone is not enough. There must be evidence. And a neutral magistrate, a judge, not an officer, decides when intrusion is justified. Its brilliance lies in that balance. It recognizes the need for law enforcement, but forces power to slow down, to explain itself, to obtain permission before it acts. It is the pause between suspicion and intrusion, the moment that keeps a republic from becoming a police state. And the meaning of unreasonable has evolved through constant litigation, each case a calibration between liberty and order. In Weeks versus United States in 1914 established an exclusionary rule. Evidence obtained illegally cannot be used in federal court. It made the Fourth enforceable but not symbolic. Mapp versus Ohio extended the exclusionary rule to the states, making the Fourth universal across jurisdictions. Katz v. United States declared that the Fourth Amendment protects people, not places. A man's conversation in a phone booth, not just his property, deserved privacy. And Terry versus Ohio in 1968 created stop and frisk, allowing searches based on reasonable suspicion. It opened the door to decades of racial profiling. In United States versus Jones, placing a GPS tracker on a car without a warrant was unconstitutional, a nod to digital privacy. In Carpenter versus United States in 2018, it required warrants for accessing cell phone location data, extending the Fourth Amendment protection into cyberspace. Every generation redefines what privacy means and how much of it we're willing to surrender, how it is protected and restricted. And the text of the Fourth remains intact. Its enforcement is fragile. Police still require warrants for home searches. Courts continue to reject overtly arbitrary surveillance. And exclusionary rules still suppresses tainted evidence. But the Patriot Act expanded government surveillance powers dramatically after 9/11, allowing bulk data collection on millions of innocent civilians. Mass surveillance programs under the NSA turned papers and effects into emails and metadata. No-knock warrants and qualified immunity have eroded accountability in policing, and private data brokers now collect and sell information with fewer checks than the state ever faced. Technology has outpaced the law. Our papers and effects no longer fit in desks and trunks, but in clouds and servers, and the founders could imagine muskets, not microchips, but their principle still applies. The more the government sees, the less the citizen owns himself. The Fourth Amendment was a revolutionary idea that even in the pursuit of safety, the government must stop at the threshold of privacy and knock. It is a covenant that says the state's reach ends where individuality begins. But that line is fading. Convenience seduces us into surveillance. Fear invites intrusion. Efficiency erodes rights, one warrant at a time. Liberty depends on friction, the resistance of law against the ease of power, and the Fourth Amendment is that friction. It slows the machinery of the state just enough for conscience to catch up. The messy truth is that freedom cannot exist without privacy, and privacy cannot exist without restraint. Every new technology, every rational crisis, every test will have this balance again. The founders didn't write the Fourth for their time. They wrote it for ours, a warning to the future that when the state can see everything, it can control everything. It's the last refuge of the individual and the first line of defense for a nation that still dares to call itself free. The Fifth Amendment, due process. No person shall be held to answer for a capital or otherwise infamous crime unless on a presentment or indictment of a grand jury, except in cases arising in the land or naval forces, or in the militia when in actual service in time of war or public danger. Nor shall any person be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life or limb. Nor shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. Nor be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Nor shall private property be taken for public use without just compensation. The Fifth Amendment is the Constitution's demand for fairness when government turns its gaze on an individual. It is the blueprint for what justice is supposed to look like when power accuses a person of wrongdoing. Limited, deliberate, and rule-bound. It is a shield that stands between the citizen and the full weight of the state. The founders came of age in a world where accusation was often as good as conviction. In England, state trials and star chambers made a mockery of justice. Confessions were extracted through torture and coercion. Property was confiscated at the whim of the crown, and the colonists, having seen such abuses, demanded a system where law would constrain vengeance. They wanted a government strong enough to enforce order, but too constrained to destroy an individual's life without process. The Fifth Amendment was a cornerstone of that vision. The Fifth builds a fortress of 5 walls, a grand jury indictment that no person faces a serious federal charge without the judgment of fellow citizens first determining there is reason to proceed. The government must persuade ordinary people before it may prosecute. 2. Double jeopardy. Once acquitted, always acquitted. The state cannot try and retry until it gets the verdict it wants. 3. Self-incrimination. No person is compelled to speak the words that condemn them. Silence itself is a constitutional right. 4. Due process. The heart of the amendment. The state cannot take life, liberty, or property without following lawful procedure. Power must follow its own rules. The takings clause. Even when property is taken for public use, the citizen must be compensated. Ownership remains a fundamental right, not a favor from the government. Together, these clauses transform justice from a weapon into a system. The distance between trial and persecution. But like everything else, the Fifth didn't apply to everyone at the time. The text spoke the language of equality, and the practice spoke the dialect of power. The Fifth's protections have evolved through hard lessons and landmark cases. Miranda versus Arizona, the police must inform suspects of their right to remain silent and to counsel. A confession extracted in ignorance of rights is no confession at all. The now familiar Miranda warning is the Fifth Amendment spoken aloud. Korematsu versus the United States. The Supreme Court upheld the internment of Japanese Americans during World War II, ignoring due process entirely. It remains one of the darkest stains on the court's history. Proof that fear can silence even the Constitution. Hamdi versus Rumsfeld. After 9/11, the court ruled that even citizens labeled enemy combatants retain the right to challenge their detention before a neutral authority. The Fifth extends even to those accused of hating the nation itself. Chicago, Burlington, and Quincy Railroad versus Chicago incorporated the takings clause against the states, ensuring that compensation for seized property is a national guarantee. Each case draws the same line and dares the government to cross it. And sometimes it does. Sometimes the courts pull it back. It is currently protected by the Miranda Rule, which still stands, reminding every officer that silence is sacred. Due process remains the spine of both criminal and civil law. Double jeopardy still bars repeated prosecution for the same act, and the takings clause requires governments to pay when they seize land or property. It is restricted, and civil asset forfeiture allows police to seize property suspected of connection to a crime, even without conviction, flipping due process and to prove your innocence. The war on terror created zones of lawlessness, indefinite detention, secret evidence, and military tribunals far from constitutional sunlight. Plea bargaining now resolves over 90% of criminal cases. Many plead guilty not because they are guilty, but because they cannot afford to fight. The Fifth Amendment survives, but its promises are routinely bent by convenience and fear. The Fifth is where the state's morality is tested. It doesn't promise perfection, only fairness, but even fairness demands courage, and it asks a nation to hold itself to procedure even when it burns for punishment. When a police officer recites the Miranda warning, the Constitution speaks. When a court throws out evidence obtained unlawfully, the Constitution breathes. And when due process is dismissed as obstruction, the Constitution bleeds. The messy truth is that every government, however democratic, will try to skip the steps that slow its power. The Fifth Amendment is a citizen's reminder that those steps are the price of civilization. Justice without process is vengeance. Vengeance dressed in law is tyranny. The Fifth Amendment stands between them. It's a quiet sentence that says the state must play fair even when it thinks it can win without doing so. The Sixth Amendment. In all criminal prosecutions, the accused shall enjoy the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury of the state and district wherein the crime shall have been committed, which district shall have been previously ascertained by law, and to be informed of the nature and cause of the accusation, to be confronted with the witnesses against him, and to have compulsory process for obtaining witnesses in his favor, and to have the assistance of counsel for his defense. If the Fifth Amendment draws the boundaries of fair process, the Sixth fills its walls and windows. It's a blueprint for what justice must look like when the state accuses a citizen of a crime. It defines fairness not as a principle, but as a procedure, a set of concrete rights designed to make sure the machinery of law cannot simply grind a person into dust. The Sixth Amendment is the difference between a republic and a regime. The colonists knew what injustice looked like. Under British rule, the accused rebels could be imprisoned indefinitely, tried in secret, or shipped to England to face distant courts and hostile juries. Accusation alone could destroy a man's life. Guilt was often an afterthought. And when the Revolution came, one of the clearest demands was for local, public, and timely justice. People wanted to face their accusers, hear their charges, and stand before juries of their peers, not royal appointees. The Sixth Amendment was born of that demand, a promise that the new republic would prosecute openly, fairly, and within reach of its citizens. The Sixth Amendment reads like a checklist, but together its clauses form a living structure: speedy trial, that justice delayed is justice denied. The government cannot punish through waiting, cannot hold the accused in purgatory while calling its process. The public trial, that the courtroom is open because sunlight is the best disinfectant. Secrecy breeds abuse. Publicity keeps it honest. An impartial jury, ordinary citizens, not officials, decide guilt or innocence. Power must persuade. The people before it may punish one of them. Notice of charges. No one may be tried for a mystery crime. The accused has a right to know exactly what is alleged. Confrontation of witnesses. The state must bring its accusers into the open. Anonymous accusation is the tool of tyrants, and it is forbidden. Compulsory process. The accused may summon witnesses in their defense, even if those witnesses prefer not to come. Assistance of counsel. Perhaps the most famous clause, the right to a lawyer, so that no citizen stands alone before the government's power. Each right exists to correct a specific abuse of monarchy. Together, they turn justice into a dialogue instead of a decree. And again, the six guarantees of impartial juries ring hollow for a lot of people: Black Americans, women, indigenous people. Even now, equality in the courtroom remains aspirational. The poor rely on overburdened public defenders. Minorities face juries that often do not reflect their communities. And the Sixth architecture is solid, but its foundation has never been level. The Sixth Amendment has built a century of case law that defines what justice must look like in practice. In Powell versus Alabama, in the infamous Scottsboro Boys case, 9 black teenagers were sentenced to death after a rushed trial with no real defense. The Supreme Court reversed the convictions, holding that the right to counsel was fundamental to a fair trial. Gideon versus Wainwright. Clarence Earl Gideon, a poor drifter in Florida, was denied a lawyer for a felony charge. From his prison cell, he handwrote a petition to the Supreme Court. The court unanimously ruled that the Sixth guarantees counsel for all defendants facing serious charges. Gideon retried with a lawyer and was acquitted. Strickland versus Washington. The court ruled that the right to counsel means effective counsel. An attorney asleep at the table or silent in court does not satisfy the Constitution. Crawford versus Washington strengthened the confrontation clause, holding that testimonial statements cannot be used unless a witness is available for cross-examination. These cases are milestones in a long march toward fairness, a reminder that justice evolves only when the system is forced to honor its own promises. And it is protected in the right to counsel and now enshrined in both federal and state law. Public trials and notice of charges are standard. Jury service remains one of the few civic duties that unite citizens across class and background. Court backlogs stretch the meaning of speedy. Defendants languish for months or years before trial sometimes. Plea bargaining dominates the system. Roughly 90% of criminal cases never reach a jury. Defendants are often poor or intimidated, and they plead guilty to avoid harsher sentences. Trading away the rights of the six was written to secure. Public defenders are underpaid and overworked. The right to counsel is hollow when your lawyer has hundreds of clients and minutes to prepare. Closed proceedings in cases of national security chip away the public trial guarantee. So the Sixth survives as principle, but often fails in practice. And the Sixth is the measure of whether the United States still believes in justice as something more than efficiency. It demands time, transparency, and human judgment, all things bureaucracy despises. It reminds us that the courtroom is not a factory for convictions, but a forum for truth, that a trial is not a ritual for punishment, but a test of fairness. Every time a citizen is tried swiftly, publicly, before impartial jurors and with a real defense and the chance to face their accusers, the Sixth Amendment has fulfilled its purpose. Every time someone pleads guilty because they can't afford a lawyer or waits years for trial or is judged by a system that no longer sees them as human, the amendment's promise is betrayed. The messy truth is that justice must be inconvenient to be real. The Sixth Amendment forces government to earn every conviction, to prove every accusation, to defend every deprivation of liberty in the light of day. Without it, law would be nothing more than a polite mask of power, and with it, even the smallest courtroom in America becomes a battlefield where one citizen's rights stand against the machinery of the state, and sometimes, miraculously, win. The Seventh Amendment. In suits at common law where the value in controversy shall exceed $20, the right of trial by jury shall be preserved, and no fact tried by jury shall be otherwise re-examined in any court of the United States than according to the rules of the common law. The Seventh Amendment is the quiet twin of the Sixth. It moves the drama of justice from the criminal dock to the civil courtroom, from the state's accusation to the quarrels between the citizens. It is the promise that ordinary people, not only judges or elites, will decide questions of fairness when money, property, or rights are at stake. It's the amendment that turns democracy into a daily habit. Before the Revolution, the Crown often denied colonists the right to juries in civil disputes, especially those involving commerce or property. Admiralty courts were staffed by royal judges, not peers, and handled courtroom cases and trade violations. These courts became symbols of the empire's contempt for colonial equality. Jefferson's Declaration of Independence listed the grievance plainly for depriving us, in many cases, of the benefits of trial by jury. To the founders, juries weren't mere formalities. They were the people's veto over authority, the citizens' chance to hold the law itself accountable. The Seventh Amendment enshrined the idea that justice should not belong solely to the powerful. It preserved the right to jury trial in civil cases, where wealth and influence often carry more weight than truth, and it forbade judges from overturning jury findings except by narrow legal rules. This was the democratic check inside the judiciary. Judges interpret the law, but juries interpret justice. They bring community conscience into the courtroom. Civil juries have decided the great moral battles of American life, from labor rights and product liability to defamation and civil rights. When a jury of citizens delivers a verdict against a corporation or a government agency, the Seventh Amendment is breathing. And as with every freedom of the founding era, the Seventh Promise was selective. Even today, wealth often decides who can afford to pursue civil justice. The amendment guarantees a right to a jury, not the means to reach one. Though it has not produced the headline decisions of the other amendments, the Seventh's influence runs deep. Beacon Theaters Incorporated versus Westover, the Supreme Court declared that the right to a jury trial in civil cases is basic and fundamental, reaffirming that it must be preserved wherever possible. Curtis versus Lowther recognized the jury trial right in federal civil rights suits, extending the amendment's reach to discrimination cases. In Toll versus the United States, it held that defendants facing civil penalties from the government are entitled to a jury on the question of liability. These rulings keep the jury box alive as a democratic space inside an increasingly bureaucratic system. And it's protected by civil juries that still exist in federal and state courts. They remain one of the few arenas where citizens, regardless of rank, may sit in judgment of corporations and governments. Their use has eroded quietly. Mandatory arbitration clauses buried in contracts force consumers and employees to surrender the right to a jury before disputes even arise. Justice is outsourced to private tribunals run for profit. Class action barriers prevent ordinary citizens from joining forces against systemic harm. Legal costs make civil trials prohibitively expensive. Most people settle or give up long before reaching a jury. The result is a two-tiered system: public justice for the rich, private arbitration for everyone else. The Seventh Amendment is one of the purest expressions of democratic faith in the Constitution. It assumes that ordinary people can judge fairly, that conscience can outweigh expertise, and that justice should never be monopolized by the powerful. Its voice has grown faint, and corporations carve escape hatches out of public courts. The people's jury is being walled off behind the fine print, Every time a group of citizens delivers a verdict that forces the mighty to pay damages or change behavior, the seventh lives. And every time a forced arbitration clause closes the courthouse door, it dies a little bit. The truth is that the jury box is as essential to liberty as a ballot box. Both place ordinary citizens above their rules, if only for a moment. The Seventh Amendment keeps the moment alive, the idea that justice, like government, must answer to the people themselves. The Eighth Amendment, excessive bail shall not be required, nor excessive fines imposed, nor cruel and unusual punishments inflicted. 16 words. But they are the moral hinge of the Constitution. The Eighth Amendment asks the hardest question a public can face. How much cruelty will it tolerate in the name of justice? It does not abolish punishment, it commands mercy. It forces a government that can take a life to pause long enough to remember that it serves human beings, not examples. The founders had seen punishment without restraint. In the 18th century England, there were more than 200 capital crimes: theft, forgery, poaching, even cutting down a tree on another man's land. Torture and public humiliation were routine. Bail was set high to keep the poor in prison. Fines were tools of plunder. The English Bill of Rights of 1689 had condemned cruel and unusual punishments. The American version sharpened that warning. After a revolution fought for human dignity, the people would not allow the state to mimic the barbarity of kings. The Eighth Amendment rests on three principles of proportion. 1. Excessive bail. Freedom before trial cannot depend on wealth. Bail exists to ensure appearance in court, not to pre-punish. 2. Excessive fines. The state may penalize but not impoverish. Punishment should correct, not confiscate. And 3. Cruel and unusual punishment. This is the heart of the amendment. What is cruel changes within civilization. The phrase is a mirror held to the conscience. Its genius is the flexibility. It allows moral progress to redefine cruelty. Hanging gave way to the chair to the needle. Each stage claimed to be more humane. Each still haunted by the same question: does killing with procedure make killing just? Well, even now, the line between justice and cruelty is blurred by class and race. The poor remain jailed for poverty, the marginalized punished more harshly, and the death penalty applied unequally. The Eighth speaks of mercy. The system often whispers profit. And for more than 2 centuries, the courts have wrestled with what those 16 words mean. In Furman versus Georgia, the Supreme Court struck down existing death penalty laws as arbitrary and capricious. The decision halted executions nationwide and forced states to rewrite their statutes. In Gregg versus Georgia in 1976, it reinstated the death penalty under new procedures, holding that capital punishment was not unconstitutional per se if fairly applied. The court said the Eighth must draw its meaning from the evolving standards of decency that mark the progress of a maturing society. In Atkins versus Virginia, executing the intellectually disabled was declared cruel and unusual. In Roper versus Simmons, executing minors was likewise forbidden. In Timms versus Indiana, applied the excessive fines clause to the states, curbing civil asset forfeiture and reinforcing that government may not use law enforcement as revenue. Each decision expands or contracts the moral circle. The Eighth evolves because conscience does. And it's protected in that the Eighth still forbids torture and clearly barbaric punishment. Bail reform movements and some state courts have begun to treat poverty-based detention as unconstitutional. Excessive fines are now vulnerable to challenge under Timms. It's restricted in that the United States continues to execute prisoners, often by methods euphemized as humane but plagued by failure. Mass incarcerations with overcrowding, violence, and neglect, it's become a structural cruelty. Solitary confinement remains common, though many psychologists call it psychological torture. Cash bail still traps the poor while the wealthy walk free. Private prisons profit from long sentences and repeat incarceration. The words survive, the spirit strains. The Eighth Amendment is the conscience of the Republic, and it demands that justice remain human, that punishment never become a spectacle, and that law remember compassion. Every reform that lessens suffering, ending in debtor's prison, curbing executions, limiting solitary, honors it. Every policy that profits from pain betrays it. Cruelty evolves, and so must mercy. The founders did not imagine electric chairs or for-profit prisons, but they gave us a standard broad enough to judge them. The Eighth Amendment is that standard. It's a moral mirror held up to the state, asking, are we still civilized? The truth is that the civilization is not measured by how we treat the powerful, but by how we punish the powerless. The Eighth reminds us that the government's true character is written not in its laws, but in its prisons. It is the heartbeat of moral restraint, the amendment that insists that justice, to remain just, must never forget mercy. The Ninth Amendment. The enumeration in the Constitution of certain rights shall not be construed to deny or disparage others retained by the people. The Ninth Amendment is a single, quiet sentence with a limitless horizon. It's the founders' acknowledgement that liberty is too vast to be listed, too alive to be confined to paper. It's the amendment that protects all others from becoming a cage. Where most of the Bill of Rights limits what governments may do, the Ninth limits what governments may assume. It tells power, our silence is not your permission. The Ninth grew out of an argument between men who feared opposite dangers. The Anti-Federalists worried that without a Bill of Rights, a new federal government would trample liberty. Hamilton in Federal 84 warned that listing rights was itself perilous. A list might imply that unlisted freedoms did not exist. If you write 10 rights, he said, power will claim the rest. Madison's answer was the Ninth Amendment. It was a bridge between enumeration and infinity. The assurance that the people's liberties did not begin or end with ink on this page. It is the Constitution's humanity clause. It's built in. It's a reminder that the framers, for all their intellect, could not foresee every way a free people might live. The Ninth is revolutionary because it admits what most governments deny, that rights precede law. It recognizes that liberty is inherent, discovered, not granted, and that government's role is to guard what it can name and stay out of what it cannot. In a document obsessed with structure and power, the Ninth is a whisper of philosophy. The people retain more than what we write. That single idea has quietly shaped every expansion of American freedom. Whenever courts have recognized a right that isn't listed, privacy, bodily autonomy, marriage, contraception, intimacy, the Ninth is there, invisible but essential. The Ninth's openness is its strength and its curse. It offers no lists, no definitions, no enforcement mechanism. It is both a shield and a blank page, and because of that, courts have hesitated to rely on it directly. Judges often fear that invoking it invites subjectivity, that it turns constitutional law into moral philosophy. And yet the framers intended precisely that elasticity. They trusted that liberty would grow with understanding. The alternative is a frozen list of 18th century rights that would have doomed the Constitution to irrelevance. And the Ninth rarely headlines a decision, but its spirit animates some of the most consequential rulings in American life. In Griswold versus Connecticut, the court struck down a ban on contraception, recognizing a zone of privacy implied by several amendments. Justice Goldberg's concurrence pointed directly to the Ninth, arguing that the right to privacy was one of those enumerated liberties retained by the people. And Roe v. Wade built on Griswold, affirming that reproductive choice falls within personal liberty protected from government interference. Obergefell Hodges is the right to marry regardless of gender was recognized as part of the broader human dignity of the Constitution, and that it protects but does not name. Each of these cases is a conversation with the Ninth Amendment, a recognition that liberty evolves, that dignity is dynamic. The Ninth still stands as a philosophical anchor for rights the framers could never imagine. And even though Roe v. Wade has been struck down, the Ninth still stands as a philosophical anchor for the rights the framers could never imagine. And even though Roe's been struck down, digital privacy, medical autonomy, gender and sexual identity, the freedom to decide who you are, it remains the text behind the curtain of modern liberty. Courts increasingly sidestep it. Conservative jurisprudence favors textualism, insisting that only enumerated rights count. The Ninth's vagueness makes it suspect in a legal culture that worships precision. Its absence from opinions is not irrelevance, but fear of admitting that freedom is bigger than control. The Ninth Amendment is the Constitution's confession that it cannot contain the whole of human dignity. It is the built-in It is the built-in humility of a nation that knows it will keep changing. Every generation uncovers new forms of liberty. It's the right to love, to learn, to think, to live in ways unimaginable in 1791. And each time the Ninth waits in the background, saying yes to those things too. Its silence is not emptiness, it's an invitation. The founders gave us a framework for freedom, not its boundaries. The Ninth Amendment is both the most radical and the most neglected promise in the Constitution. It tells us that liberty is not finished, that rights are not a finite list, but a living inheritance. It's the amendment that makes all the others possible. The reminder that the ultimate author of freedom is not the government, not the courts, but the people themselves. The 10th Amendment, reserved powers and the double-edged sword. The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states, respectively, or to the people. The 10th Amendment is the final line of the Bill of Rights and the closing argument of the Anti-Federalist. It is a promise that the new national government, powerful though it might be, would not swallow the sovereignty of the states or the independence of the people. It was written as reassurance, a declaration that the Constitution created a government of limited delegated authority. But like every promise about power, it cuts both ways. The 10th is the amendment that can be invoked by those who defend liberty and by those who would deny it. It is the amendment that keeps the federal system alive and the one that has been used to justify some of its darkest chapters. In 1787, Anti-Federalists saw the proposed Constitution as a trap. They looked at its clauses, necessary and proper, supremacy, general welfare, and saw the makings of an empire. Patrick Henry warned that the federal government would oppress the people with the same engines of despotism which have been employed in every other part of the world. The Federalists promised otherwise. Madison and Hamilton argued that enumerated powers would confine the federal government and that everything else would remain with the states and the people. Still, the skeptics wanted it written down. The 10th Amendment was their demand in ink. The federal government gets only what the Constitution gives it, nothing more. It was a closing reassurance that allowed ratification to go forward. And the 10th is federalism distilled into a sentence. It divides authority not for efficiency, but for liberty. Power, the framers knew, is self-replicating. It expands like water seeking the lowest ground. The only way to contain it is to split it. In theory, this division guards freedom on two fronts. The federal government protects the people from the states when local tyranny rises. The states protect people from the federal government when national ambition overreaches. Between them stands the individual, the point around which both revolve. The system's brilliance is that it forces constant tension. The United States was designed not for harmony but for argument. The 10th is the clause that keeps the argument going. The same decentralization that protects liberty can also protect oppression, and the 10th Amendment has been a banner for freedom and for injustice, for progress and for cruelty. In one century, it sheltered the abolitionist states that defied the Fugitive Slave Act. In another, it shielded segregationists who claimed states' rights to resist desegregation. It is invoked both by those who seek to expand rights locally, legalizing marijuana, protecting sanctuary cities, creating climate policy, and by those who seek to restrict them, like banning books and curbing reproductive freedom and suppressing votes. The 10th is proof that power itself is neutral. It bends toward whatever wields it. And the struggle over the 10th has shaped every major crisis in American history. In McCulloch versus Maryland, Chief Justice John Marshall upheld Congress's authority to create a national bank, declaring that the Constitution grants implied powers. The decision tipped the scales toward federal supremacy and warned that the power tax involves the power to destroy. The nullification crisis of 1832, South Carolina tried to declare federal tariffs void within its borders. President Andrew Jackson threatened force, insisting that the Union was perpetual. The 10th had met its limit. During the Civil War, the Confederacy's claim to secede was a direct appeal to the 10th. Lincoln's victory redefined the amendment. The Union, not the states, was the ultimate guarantor of liberty. Civil rights era, a century later, governors once again cried states' rights to defend segregation. The federal government intervened, sending troops to enforce desegregation, passing the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act. The 10th could no longer be an alibi for injustice. Modern federalism. The pendulum keeps swinging, and the United States v. Lopez limited Congress's reach under the Commerce Clause. The court ruled that a federal ban on guns near schools exceeded enumerated powers. The same logic fuels contemporary fights over health care, environmental regulation, and immigration. Every generation redraws the line between federal reach and local right. How it is protected and restricted today is what is important. The 10th still empowers the states and laboratories of democracy. Local governments experiment where Washington hesitates. Reforms on criminal justice, drug policy, and renewable energy often begin at the state level and ripple outward. But federal supremacy, reinforced through funding and regulation, often dictates state behavior. Congress doesn't need to command directly. It can attach strings to money. Cooperative federalism has become dependence by another name. And at the same time, the 10th has been weaponized. Its states invoke it to justify policies that restrict individual freedom, like abortion bans, anti-trans legislation, voter suppression laws, proving that decentralization is no guarantee of justice. The 10th Amendment is both a promise and a paradox. It protects the liberty by dividing power, yet its very division allows power to hide. When the federal government grows too strong, the 10th stands as a brake. When the states abuse autonomy to oppress their own citizens, the same amendment becomes their shield. It is the line that keeps government from becoming a monolith, but also the loophole through which tyranny can return by local hand. The founders meant it as reassurance. They could not have foreseen a nation of 50 states bound by technology, economy, and law, so interwoven that separation is illusion. Yet their principles endure. Freedom survives where no single authority reigns unchecked. The messy truth is that the 10th Amendment, like the nation it governs, is perpetually in flux. A conversation, not a commandment. It reminds us that power must always be argued over, never assumed, and that liberty to endure requires friction between the levels of government meant to serve it. It was the Anti-Federalist last words in 1791, and it remains ours today, the perpetual question at the heart of the Republic: who decides? The Bill of Rights was the peace offering that allowed the Constitution to live. It turned theory into law, 10 promises that no government, however righteous it believed itself to be, could violate. So, the fight continues. The Constitution was not a peace treaty, it was a truce. The ink had barely dried before the war of ideas it embodied resumed in the pages of newspapers, the chambers of Congress, and the hearts of the citizens. The fight between Federalists and Anti-Federalists never truly ended. It simply changed uniforms. The debate over the proper scale of government, the balance between liberty and order, unity and autonomy, continues to shape every argument in American history. The founders did not agree on the answer. They designed a system that forces the question to be asked forever. In 1787, the Federalists Madison, Hamilton, and Jay believed that only a strong central government could hold the fragile new Union together. The Articles of Confederation had proven that liberty without power was chaos. They feared a republic too weak to defend itself, too disjointed to endure. The Anti-Federalists, Mason, Henry Yates, in the chorus of pamphleteers writing as Brutus, Cato, and Sentinel, feared the opposite, that a government strong enough to hold the states together would soon be strong enough to crush it. They believed virtue lived close to the soil, in local governments, and in neighbors who knew each other's names. They distrusted distant power. And both sides claimed to defend the Revolution's promise. The Federalists say that order is liberty's foundation. The Anti-Federalists saw order as liberty's tomb. And the Constitution didn't resolve that conflict. It institutionalized it. It created a federal system designed to argue with itself, a structure that breathes through disagreement. And Hamilton wanted vigor in government. He saw energy as the lifeblood of republics, the ability to act decisively in war, trade, and diplomacy. And to him, unity was strength, and strength was survival. And his America would have a national bank, a standing army, and a central government powerful enough to steer the young nation through the storms of history. Madison was more cautious, and he built safeguards into that energy, checks and balances and separations of powers that extended to the republic. All were meant to prevent the very tyranny Hamilton's power might enable. And to the Federalists, a strong government was not a threat to liberty, it was liberty's scaffolding. Without order, rights dissolve into anarchy. To Mason, Henry, and their allies, this was heresy, and they had just defeated an empire. Why build a new one? Henry thundered that the Constitution is the most fatal plan that could possibly be conceived to enslave a free people. Mason refused to sign the document at all, warning that it lacked a Bill of Rights and would allow the federal government to devour the states. They feared consolidation, that distant officials would rule by decree, insulated from the people's will. They feared an executive who would crown himself in ambition, a judiciary that would legislate from the bench, and a Congress that would forget its voters the moment it reached the Capitol. They demanded written guarantees. The Federalists yielded, and the result was a Bill of Rights, a peace offering, and a promise that liberty would be spelled out in ink. But peace never followed. The same argument revived in every century, dressed in new clothes. Lincoln and the Union fought the Civil War under the banner of the Federalist unity. The Confederacy cloaked itself in anti-Federalist rhetoric and the states' rights. FDR wielded Hamilton's energy to rescue a nation from depression, expanding federal power into every corner of economic life. His opponents accused him of betraying the 10th Amendment, of turning the Republic into a bureaucracy. The Civil Rights Movement demanded federal enforcement of liberty against states that used local control as a weapon of oppression. Eisenhower's troops at Little Rock were the embodiment of Federalist principle, the national government stepping in to make freedom real. The Reagan Revolution resurrected anti-Federalist language, shrinking Washington's footprints, restoring local autonomy, and railing against centralized authority. Each generation reenacts the founding debate. Each claims the other has betrayed the Constitution, and each, in its own way, is right. The Federalist impulse builds, it creates unity, national defense, infrastructure, civil rights laws, and social security nets. It makes the united in United States mean something real. The Anti-Federalist impulse resists. It defends local control, community, and identity, and the skepticism of distant authority. It reminds power that government, however noble its intentions, will always be tempted to grow. And when either side dominates, the republic falters. Too much federalism and liberty suffocates under bureaucracy and surveillance. Too much anti-federalism and liberty disintegrates into chaos and inequality. The genius of the Constitution is that it forces both sides to coexist, to argue, to restrain, to correct each other. It's built not for peace, but for productive tension. Today, the debate persists under new names: federal government versus states' rights, or big government versus small governments, national security versus individual freedom. And when progressives argue that only national action can address climate change, healthcare, or civil rights, they speak with Hamilton's voice. And when conservatives demand local autonomy, limited regulation, and protection from federal mandates, they channel Mason and Henry. The Constitution contains both impulses because America needs both: the power to act and the courage to question that power. Federalists keep the nation strong. Anti-Federalists keep it honest. The tension is not dysfunction, it's design. The founders understood that liberty lives in conflict. The government that never argues has either silenced its opposition or surrendered its soul. Every lawsuit between a state and Washington, every protest against federal overreach, every demand for national reform is a continuation of that original argument. We are still in Philadelphia, still at the table with Hamilton's ambition and Henry's suspicion staring each other down. The Constitution survives because neither has ever won. The fight between Federalists and Anti-Federalists is never meant to end. It's the pulse of the Republic. It's the constant negotiation between freedom and order and between unity and independence. When the country leans too far toward control, the Anti-Federalists rise to remind us that power consolidates by habit. When it leans too far toward fragmentation, the Federalists return to rebuild the center. That friction is not our flaw, it's our genius. The Republic breathes through argument. America was built to fight with itself, because a nation that stops fighting over the meaning of liberty has already lost it. The Constitution's brilliance is not that it resolved the struggle between the Federalist structure and the Anti-Federalist skepticism, but that it bound them together forever, the hammer and the anvil on which democracy must constantly be forged. We are their descendants, still disputing the same questions, just with new tools. How much power is enough to secure liberty, and how much is too much to keep it? The argument never ends, and it never should.